Oh,
Okay.
host disabled participant screen sharing.
Oh, sorry, I always forget to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, they just
Okay, so yeah, this is the volume, this is the Kubernetes SIG storage volume populators meeting, um, for those watching the recording, if anyone. Uh, so I think as of the last meeting, the KEP hadn't been merged, so it was merged later that afternoon for those that don't know. So that's good news. Um, here is the version of it that got merged, or here's the KEP, or here's the PR for the KEP that merged. Um, so Tim did have a bunch of questions about it. We answered as many as we could, and he sort of agreed to approve it from an API perspective, but he implied that he wanted to sort of follow up on some of the loose ends that he wasn't entirely happy with. So I have an action to sort of either get him into one of these meetings or schedule another meeting to sort of go over the remaining API issues. But we can go over some of them here because I'm curious to know what other people's opinions are on how we should handle some of this stuff, so that in case the eventual meeting with Tim can't include everyone, I can at least represent everyone's opinion. So let me go down here. Get all Shing's feedback, David's feedback, Saad's feedback. Okay, so yeah, Tim did sort of imply that he preferred the validating webhook approach, where if you specify a PVC that has a data source that we don't consider valid, as in the data source or the populate data source validation controller, that we should actually prevent the creation of those PVCs. I mean, we discussed this a while back, and our stance was the logic for allowing the creation of the PVCs was that it could be the case that the data source is going to become valid later. And if you have a declarative style workload where you just want to sort of declare all of your pods and PVCs and everything and wait for them to get satisfied, it can make sense to allow the PVCs to be created even before their dependencies become valid. So that was that's the case that I made to him on why it's better to have an asynchronous controller that emits events than a validation controller. But we haven't heard his response to that yet, so he may still have different feelings about how that should work. Um, the other big question was about the existing behavior on the admission controller in Kube API server, where currently if the feature gate is turned off and you specify what would be an invalid data source, Kube API server just blanks out the field and goes ahead and creates your PVC anyways, which he thinks is kind of crazy. And I think we all kind of agree that that's a really weird thing to do. Um, but that's how it's been implemented for a long time. And I think if we change that, we'd have backwards compatibility problems. So we need to have a discussion about, like, can we change that in a backwards compatible way? Is there a better behavior in the long run? And then the one corner case that still exists, which is even with the feature gate turned on, if you specify a data source that has an API group that is the empty string, so sort of the core API group, uh, we still fall back to the old behavior of blanking out your data source for backwards compatibility reasons. Um, and I guess we kind of need to resolve what should happen there. Tim had suggested that maybe it's okay to use core objects as data sources. If somebody wants to write a populator that like turns a pod into a PVC, like, who are we to stop them? Um, the main counter argument against that is we don't have any way to prevent multiple well, okay, let me put it this way. If you have two populators that are both trying to populate from the same kind of data source, they will collide with each other in a bad way. They'll basically fight over the PVC, and whoever wins will win. And we really don't want that behavior. So what we've done is we sort of have an informal the rule that we need to formalize at this point, which is that every populator should have its own CRD type for a data source. And as long as every populator implementation creates a new CRD that is its data source that it understands, we'll never have this problem where two different populators will be attempting to respond to the same PVC and to populate it. And therefore, if you wanted to basically have a populator that could take a pod and turn it into a PVC, my recommendation would be introduce a new CRD that points to the pod, and then have the PVC point to that object. And so you have this extra level of indirection. And then if somebody else wanted to also write a populator that could turn a pod into a PVC or any other core object, you could do something similar with just a different CRD in the middle that points to the same pod. And that would sort of prevent the two from ever fighting with each other. And it would also obviate the need to ever have the core object directly reflected in the data source field of a PVC. So is everyone kind of on the same page with that
Yeah, I think
proposal?
that makes sense. Maybe you just need to write those down. Maybe those are not.
Yeah. I mean, we need to keep sharpening up the KEP and the designs and explain all this. And we need, and eventually this feature will need documentation, both user-facing documentation and developer-facing documentation. So we're going to have to get all that stuff sorted out, and we're going to have to make very clear this rule that if you implement a data populator, you need to also create a new CRD that is the data source, so that we don't end up in the situation where two populators are trying to deal with the same data source. Um, okay, so that was another, that was the third sort of big topic that came up. Okay, and I updated the KEP to sort of go through how the initial version of the KEP didn't explain how populators work. So given that we now have a prototype that actually functions reasonably well, I went ahead and described how that prototype works in the KEP. And that made Tim happier.
So
There was some.
is the plan to eventually you have this Hello Populator, right? Is the plan eventually to put that under like Kubernetes 6 or Kubernetes CSI?
Yes. So actually, if you look at the Hello Populator right now, like the package name actually says github.com/Kubernetes CSI, and then I
Okay.
think it says Hello Populator. We need to change the repo name, I think. But yeah, the intention is.
Be written here, right? Is that his concern? If you talked a little bit more about the Hello Populator, then maybe.
No. So when I first wrote this KEP for Kubernetes 1.18, all I was doing was introducing the data source, any data source feature gate at that time, and at that point we really had no idea how the populators were going to work, other than that we were going to be relying on some sort of PV swap mechanism, or a rebind mechanism, and that I had prototyped more than a year ago to sort of prove that. Actually, now that I think about it, probably a year and a half ago or 2 years ago, to prove that the basic idea would work. So I had wanted to write the KEP in a very Kubernetes focused way that was like, we're just changing this feature gate. The implementation of populators is going to be out of tree. And so that's how I initially wrote it. And he said, no, let's explain how populators really should work, so that it's clearly understood for everyone in the Kubernetes community who's reading this KEP what you're supposed to do, whether or not you use the library that I wrote, which may or may not turn into a sidecar in the near future. I have taken a look at taking the library portion of the Hello Populator repo to and turning it into a sidecar, and there's some issues there with the communication mechanism between the actual populator and the sidecar when it comes to sort of specifying what the pod should look like, because that's the big job of the interaction between the library. Can do all of the work except for deciding what should go in the pod spec for the pod that will do the population. And so it makes a callback into the populator, in this case the sample populator, to say, give me some details for the pod spec that I will then turn into an actual pod that will actually do the work. And then everything else is sort of done by the library. It's going to be hard to do that through a gRPC interface, because you'd be passing a Kubernetes object through a gRPC interface, which is never done. Maybe what we would do is sort of turn it into JSON and shove the JSON through the gRPC pipe, and require that the thing on the other end can like parse it, or something. We need to talk about that, but that's not a concern that Tim had. That's just a design concern that we're going to have to address eventually. But to answer your question, Shing, yeah, the Hello Populator should just become like populator library or something, or data populator, volume populator. That's what we'll call the repo. It will have all the library components in it that you would need to write an actual populator. And then everything that's in the hello populator would become like an example in
Mhm.
a subdirectory in that repo. And so then the idea would be that the primary purpose of that repo would be to host the library that you would consume if you're writing an actual populator. And then there'd just be a sample there that you could look at that would do the hello world thing. um, and that's my eventual goal with that library. And I guess that needs to be done during the 121 release so that we can have a shipping version of that available. And the other big thing that needs to be done now that the KEP is approved is getting the actual validator controller merged and the volume populator CRD merged and released, so that like deployers can start to use it. So I'm sort of getting to a different topic now, but yeah, the work for the rest of this release primarily is going to be on releasing the components that are going to be necessary for deployers and for developers who want to write populators. And then, it'll be a beta feature. And until we have actual implementations of populators out in the world that people are using, it'll probably be staying in beta. I think the KEP criteria for moving to GA was that we need some number of actual populators in production use. So
Mhm.
that'll, we want to lay the foundation so that can happen after the 121 release goes out, um, to encourage people to write real populators. And of course, we want to leverage all that into the backup and restore design that we're covering in the data protection working group. So I want to make sure that covers. Oh, that there was one other area of feedback that Tim provided, which was about metrics. So he was suggesting that it would be cool to know how long it takes for PVCs to bind. From the time the user creates the PVC until the populator completes its work and then binds it and the user can do his thing. If we could like capture those timings and produce a histogram of values, that would be useful to an operator, not a software operator, but a human operator, running a Kubernetes cluster to see if how these things are going. And my response to that was, yeah, we need that same data for every PVC, right? Whether it's an empty PVC or it's a clone of a volume or a clone of a snapshot, having this timing information that you can turn into a histogram is really valuable. And that seems like it should be a core function of the PVC bind controller, or of something in the core, because this is something we want across all PVCs. We want to be able to time how long it takes for them to become bound. And
There are
metrics there.
already metrics there for the in-tree PVC.
Yeah, I know that there are metrics, but
Yeah.
is there timing information that you can capture the length of the elapsed time from object creation to bind?
I think it
And
show it. I think it probably just count the whole time. It probably does not show how long does it take to bind or something, but it's like how long does it take for the whole operation to finish. So it's the entire thing. I'm not sure exactly.
well,
Uh,
but I mean, remember, so there's a bunch of different controllers involved when you create a PVC.
yeah, so there are also like sidecars, for example, like if you look at external provisioner, it has that already. It has metrics already. So if you look at that, there is a different set of metrics um, that is in external provisioner, and then in the E-tree there is
Right.
another.
Yeah. No, I mean, I know the external provisioner has its metrics for the work
Yeah.
it's doing, but
Yeah.
like it would not capture any sort of other delays. So from the time, the user goes and just creates a PVC, and that's basically immediate, right? As soon as that gets through the admission controller and Kube API server, the PVC exists, right? Now it's just sitting there waiting for someone to do something with it. And if you have a CSI plugin running, it will see that PVC and then decide to go do something with it. But like, it might take some time for it to even notice the PVC is there. And then from the time it notices that it's there until it starts calling, CSI RPCs, could be more time, if it's backed up with a bunch of other work, or its queues are full, or whatever. There's all kinds of things that can happen that would slow down the reaction time from PVC exists to, CSI plugin is actually invoked and doing some work. And then even when the CSI plugin is done and the sidecar creates the PV in response to the PVC, it's still not done, right? Because the bind controller has to see that PVC and then bind the PVC to it. And that's like another step.
Yeah, so I
And
don't know what the entry one measure, to be honest. I know they
yeah,
have some metrics. Entry have something maybe that actually counts the whole period, or maybe just the count number of it, number of
yeah.
operations failed or success. That could be
I
that
mean,
too.
what I would want if I was an administrator, I would want to know like the total time from PVC got created by the user to PVC became bound, and just whatever else happened in the middle there is sort of irrelevant. Just you want to those two timestamps. PVC was created, PVC got bound, subtract them, and that's your elapsed time. Um, and I don't know if we collect that metric, but if we, it would be a good thing to add. So I was going to propose that as sort of a community-wide enhancement for for storage metrics if we don't already have it. Um,
Would you want metrics on an, I guess the question that I would ask is that does seem like a very valuable metric, but the other thing that I was thinking of is there a more specific metric around how long it takes for a volume populator to populate the volume
well, yeah.
itself?
So the thinking was, if you could obtain this metric of elapsed time from PVC got created to PVC got bound, and you were just basically producing a histogram of that data, if you could then filter by data source type, so like how long did my empty PVCs take to create on average, how long did my snapshot clones take to create on average, and how long did like my random data source X take to create on average, because that's sort of how you would measure the performance of a specific populator. Is you would look at all the PVCs that had data sources of a kind that that populator was responsible for and produce a histogram of those PVCs. And presumably it would be slower than other types because there's more work to be done. But how much slower would be of great interest to an administrator,
What a,
because if it's ridiculously slow, like it's taking an hour to bind a PVC, like that's not a very usable system. If it's taking 30 seconds, that's kind of slow, but maybe within bounds if you need to move a lot of data around. Like I don't know. So
yeah, and I think I was also wondering if, I don't know what data we collect now, so sorry, this is just out of left field, but
yeah,
would
I
they be different
also
than, like like the CSI plugins for like a dynamic PV creation? Do we capture the metrics for that? And would
oh
that would that become a red herring in that data set?
yeah, I don't know enough about what the current metric system does and what it's able to do to be able to answer that. But yes, we would
Yeah,
certainly want to make sure that the existence of populators wasn't messing up any existing metrics.
right.
And then we would also want to have some metrics on the populator controller that, just covered the things the populator controller knows about. Like it can measure how long it took for the pod to run that did the populating, but like I think total round trip time from PVC creation to bind time is the metric that really matters, because that's the user observable latency, um, from the time that they made a request to the time it got satisfied. So yeah, there's just some more suggestions for making metrics better, which I think it's good that people are thinking about that kind of thing, because it's easy to ignore it when you're developing a new feature. So we're going to be taking notes of all the ideas for metrics and figuring out how to address them all. And I don't know what the I don't know if we'll get all the metrics in 121, but we'll do what we can, and we'll have a list of the rest of the ones we want to add later. All right. Yeah, with introduce and follow up. So that covers the stuff that Tim wanted to talk about, and I'll still have to schedule that meeting. And yeah, the only other thing to discuss today is sort of the plan for the rest of this release, which I already started talking about, which is just get the CRD and the data source validator controller merged and released before the 121 release happens, because we're going to be including guidance with the 121 release that like you should install this CRD and this controller alongside your Kubernetes 121 deployment so that population works, so that users can get feedback when they have data sources that are invalid. So that's sort of the main implementation item between now and then. And of course, I'll keep working on the actual library, getting it in the right place, and making it available. But that's going to be in flux as we figure out, whether we can make it a sidecar or not. So future discussions, can we make it a sidecar? Does it need to remain a library? Where exactly is it going to live? Somewhere in Kubernetes CSI is my intention. We got to come up with a name. So that's what I had for today. And it sounds like I'm going to have to do more effort to track Tim down and get a meeting scheduled. I will see if I can get him to come to the next one of these, but maybe something earlier, maybe something later if it doesn't fit his calendar. Yeah. So, Elliot, do you know anything about metrics by any chance?
Not really. I haven't touched metrics either.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, it seems to be one of those areas that few people know about. So I
yeah, it's just
Look of
I heard
the
it's a lot of work. But
controller just added the metrics.
did you do that work, Sheng?
I didn't do that work. So Xiangqian has a design doc. Grant is the one who implemented it. You can take a look.
Okay. Yeah, it would be good just to sort of speak to someone that's familiar with it, or maybe just review their change and sort of copy what they did, because yeah, I just don't have a lot of exposure to how metrics work today. But I want to do that because yeah, it's important, it's valuable.
Yeah, so this is basically just so we're checking the total count of operations and also like the duration, how long it takes for each from the start to end. So this is not this one in sidecar. In sidecar is already covered, right? So this is the snapshot controller. Maybe this is more relevant actually for you. This is like an independent controller.
Okay, yeah, we would want to copy those metrics from the snapshot controller to the Populator library so that the Populator library would generate them, and then maybe the library will need some more machinery to help collect them and expose them through a metrics endpoint that then consumers of the library can use. Because yeah, I don't even know how that works, but we want to make sure that like all the metrics are reusable, so that multiple populators don't have to do any extra legwork to get the metrics. Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'll have to figure that out too.
I can share with you the doc he wrote and the PR background. You can start from there.
Were you going to send a link or something to that?
Yeah, I was.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. We can do it in Slack because I don't. Yeah. Unless there's anything else for this meeting, I think we'll wrap it up.
Okay.
And then I'll write up some notes and I'll start working on getting Tim to show up to the next meeting. All right. If no one else has anything, we're done. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.